Moving on quickly, our second keynote speaker is Mikael Wigell from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He's the director there. And the Institute and Mikael participated in preparing a report recently on the state of the common Nordic aspects of resilience and the way forward, which is precisely the topic we're covering here. And it's going to be extremely interesting to hear how this is amplifiable, perhaps, from a Nordic to an NB, Nordic-Baltic setting. So, Mikael, please.
Let's see. All right. All right. So thanks a lot, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, what I will do is to present this report that we produced and published in September at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs with funding from the Nordic Council of Ministers. And you can find this report from our website, fiia.fi. The sort of aim and goals of our work was to really map and assess the existing Nordic crisis preparedness and security supply models. We were tasked with coming up with or assessing potential disruptive drivers to our present crisis preparedness systems, evaluate the current status and potential of Nordic cooperation within this field, and then provide up-to-date knowledge and some practical recommendations to decision makers. So what we did was that, or what we have in this report is really I dare to say, the most comprehensive study of Nordic preparedness to date. This is a pretty dense report, and it supplies a lot of new data and comparative data and analysis on Nordic resilience and crisis preparedness. We did a lot of interviews, lengthy interviews. We have a lot of data as such. So the structure of the report is the following. First we look at threat perceptions in the Nordic countries. What sort of threats and risks do the Nordics prepare to, and how do they go about doing those assessments? We look at the key concepts and definitions that we work with in the Nordics. There's a lot of different terminology here. We talk about crisis preparedness, civil preparedness, crisis management. We talked about societal security, total defense. These are different concepts that sort of function as the basis for the preparedness work in the Nordics. The Nordics use different language here. We think that we should go about talking about resilience, in fact. Resilience in an umbrella term that really gets all of these things that have this different terminology now. You can assemble those within the concept of resilience. So we compare those things, how it's done in the Nordics. We look at actors and responsibilities. Who's responsible for doing what in preparedness work in the Nordics? We compare it and we come up with a map that shows exactly who's responsible for what. Ministry of Justice in Sweden is responsible for these tasks of preparedness. The Ministry of Interior in Finland for that. And we compare that. So now the Nordic decision makers and policy makers, they have a map when they want to contact a colleague in another country. They know whom to contact. Before they haven't known whom to contact. It makes collaboration easier. We look at vital functions of society. Has it talked about what are the sort of vital functions of society? Those are the sort of, part of that is the NATO baseline criteria that goes through what are the necessary functions, necessary critical functions for the society to function in a crisis. And we'll look at how the public-private dialogue is organized in the Nordic countries, because this is an absolutely vital aspect to involve the private sector into preparedness work, of course. Most of the critical functions are in the hands of private sector actors. So no preparedness work can be done without the private sector, in fact. And then we'll look at existing collaborative frameworks. So let's skip here a bit let's go to the key takeaways from this report. So it's clear that the Nordics and the Baltic region, actually, if we look at the Baltic Sea region as such, it's one of the most interconnected regions in the world. That also means that we have a lot of common threats and risks facing ourselves. So we're, in many ways, a similar situation in this region up here, which is an argument for cooperating. It's very difficult to prepare for some of these threats on your own. A problem with the electric grid in Finland will spill over to Sweden and Norway, or a problem with data cables that goes undersea data cables in the Baltic Sea will spill over to other countries. We're very data intensive societies, by the way, these days. So a cut of a data cable, undersea cable, will create a lot of problems. We need to prepare for those kinds of things together. No country, we have very different sort of strengths amongst the Nordics and the Baltics, which provide them for complementarities as well if we decide to cooperate. So that would be important to do much more cooperation. There is not that much at the present, actually. We would need to step that up. The other key takeaway is that for all the differences in terminology and for all the differences in organizing preparedness work in the Nordics, there actually is, when one goes a bit deeper, there actually exists a Nordic approach to preparedness and resilience, what we call the Nordic resilience approach. And it consists of 4 elements. So the first element is that all the Nordics, they use what we call a whole of society approach. So it's not only the state that is involved with preparedness work. It's the whole society. We need to include NGOs, the civil society, private actors into preparedness work because the threats and risks are such that it's not possible to prepare for those with state action alone. The second common element to Nordic resilience is that all the countries, they use a sort of a whole of a government approach. It's not only one unit which is responsible for preparedness work. You need to include a lot of different authorities in preparedness work because the risks are very diverse. So it needs to be going on at the decentralized level and in a panoply of different ministries and units, and that's important. Third, an all hazards approach is a common denominator for all the Nordics. So we prepare for a panoply of different risks and threats, from crisis threats, risks, to terrorism, military ones, hybrid threats, cyber attacks, supply shocks. So the sort of risk and threats that our societies are faced with are very, very broad. So we need this all hazards approach. It's a very important element of any preparedness work, actually. And lastly, what has it again was already talked about a bit was societal resilience thinking, something that is common in the Nordics. It's clear that resilience work needs to include this societal aspect very much, and I think Hasit explained for it quite well. So what we do 4 recommendations in this report. And this report, of course, it looked at Nordic cooperation, Nordic preparedness, but I think a lot of this actually goes for the Baltic as well, and we are sort of a common region here, a common strategic space in many ways with the Baltic. So I think these recommendations could be extended also to the Baltic region. The first is that we would need a Nordic resilience framework agreement. There's a lot of different bilateral, multilateral agreements in different sectors at the time being, and they're spread out here and there. It would be good to put them under this common umbrella framework. It wouldn't replace any existing agreements, but it would make it much more easier to actually plan forward and in a flexible manner. And this could also elevate, indeed, the concept of resilience then as well. Now there's this babel of different terminology used. The second is we need to share risk perceptions and foresight. At the time being, the different countries, they do it on a national level. But as said, we're a very interconnected region faced by similar risks and threats. It would pay off to share risk perceptions and do some work together when it comes to this. So, and it shouldn't be too difficult to set up risk workshops sharing of situational awareness, joint strategic foresight, and scenario building reports, and also exercising is, of course, a vital element of this. The third big recommendation, the most controversial, I suppose, and what I hear, is actually to set up a Nordic Resilience Fund. Could be a Nordic-Baltic Resilience Fund, by the way. This work needs some funding as well. If we're going to prepare well, we need to prepare for joint operations, joint acquisition of critical material, perhaps a production, manufacturing. This needs to be funded from somewhere. And we have good examples of existing emergency supply funds. In Finland, we have one, as it was referring to it. New Zealand has an excellent system as well. There are these existing systems that we can copy and bring up to a regional level as well. And the fourth and last recommendation is the setting up of a resilience public-private network. So since we are this interconnected region, and since a lot of the critical functions and services and infrastructure are in the hands of the private sector actors, we need to establish a much closer dialogue between the public and private sector. At present, there is not much of a dialogue at the regional level, even though a lot of the companies that are involved with critical supplies and infrastructure, they work across borders, of course. So we would need to set up this network that brings together the public and private sector into this dialogue on these risks and threats. A lot of the best assessments are with private companies, actually. They are the ones knowing about potential supply shocks, for instance. But the private sector also need information from the public sector on how to do preparedness work. And by the way, there is, of course, in the EU framework, there's the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, which is being implemented as we speak, which will put a lot of new responsibilities on the private sector. So far, this has been a lot on a voluntary basis, also in the Nordic space, that the private sector is involved on a voluntary basis. Now, going forward, at least for those that are members of the EU, there will be a lot of new responsibilities put on the private sector. And the definition of critical functions here is very broad, so it will touch upon a lot of different private sector companies, actually. So that's something to also note and prepare for a bit. That was my 12-minute, I suppose.
All right, thank you very much, sir. A quick questions, yes, please. I see a hand over there. I think I might, once again, we're running behind the schedule. That's my fault. But so a question there. I will have enough time for another over there. Okay. So 2 questions, 3 questions from the audience, and from me as well. 1. So let's do this. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Raivo Raudzeps. I'm a lawyer advising, among other things, on defense and security procurements. My question actually relates to your suggestion to have a kind of a regional resilience agreement. Now, if one day, hopefully, Sweden and Finland will join NATO, well, basically all Nordic and Baltic countries will be member states of NATO. And there are structures within NATO, including committees consisting of representatives of nations which, among other things, deal with crisis management matters which are very closely linked to this resilience idea. So do you think such a regional agreements idea is still valid nowadays? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will just, there was another question over there. Before that, I will just remind the audience that Mikael is going to join us for the last panel as well. So we don't have to ask all of the questions right now. We'll have an opportunity later as well. Please, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mikael, for your presentation, also to introducing us. I'm here. Yeah, introducing us was your, let's say, organization publication as well. So I'm a representative from State Fire and Rescue Service of Latvia. So we are the National Civil Protection Authority here. Just maybe the practical question, which also fits maybe to the previous speaker. let's say that you mentioned that, of course, we understand that private sector is important in a resilience or making resilience in all the sectors. What do you think in a practical way? So if we look at companies like SAS and Neste, companies, big companies in the Nordic area, and if we look at a shareholders, let's say, list, there is the governments also included. So the part of the shareholders, actually, the governments are there. So do you think that in such, let's say, if the country is looking at some critical services, so the government should take also the part of it just to guarantee, or to, let's say, not making the rules how to govern the organization, but actually to secure that different, let's say, different part of the resilience work is, let's say, not dictated, but is also included in a businesses. I hope you understand my question. So should we look at such model as already exists in a Nordic, let's say, example, or should we move in a different area? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Madam Ambassador, please. Can we,
I speak very loudly, so I don't need a mic.
but we are, I think we are recording this, so.
Thank you, Mikael. Hugely interesting. Quick question. You talked about the common sort of denominators between the of the Nordic countries, and I'm very curious, what was sort of the weak point? Could you identify, like, what's our weakest link? And I have a fair hunch that it might be related to communication.
Okay, thank you very much. Let us cover these, and then I'll have a quick additional question that might ease us into our next panel. Mikael, please.
Yeah. Well, first the question about if Finland or when Finland and Sweden joins NATO, whether there is then a necessity for this sort of broad framework agreement. NATO deals with some aspects of resilience, which are basically linked to military crises in the end. There's a lot of civil aspects of resilience which NATO does not really deal with. And if you look at, and of course NATO is moving in the direction of more sort of civil resilience as well. There are the baseline criteria that moves into that direction, but even the baseline criteria is actually there for securing the military functioning of defense, right? But if we think of total defense in general, there's a lot of aspects that NATO has no sort of, doesn't work with. You can have ecological crisis, you might have threats to our financial systems. There's a whole lot of sort of risks of threats, and that we would need to step up resilience to, which NATO doesn't deal with at the time being. So those are the ones especially that we should put a lot of emphasis on as well. Let me just add this, that when Finland and Sweden joins NATO, the sort of deterrence goes up, of course, in a military way. But that will not in any way exclude hybrid threats. And I think actually hybrid threats will become even more pertinent once we join NATO, because that's the way then aggressors can actually try to influence our countries, because militarily it will be so difficult. So we will actually see some of those risks being stepped up. Now, when it comes to what's the model for including the private sector in preparedness work, the second question, as I interpret it. You can see two models, right? A voluntary one and a regulatory one. So far, it's been on the voluntary side. In Finland, for instance, and in many of the other Nordic countries, you have these different forums for including the private sector actors into preparedness work on a voluntary basis. In Finland, it's been working relatively well. Now we're moving into a direction of a more regulatory model, where you actually require inclusion as well. And that comes with, for instance, the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, that the EU is right now putting a lot of focus on. So in Finland, we will need to move in a regulatory, towards more of a regulatory model than before, whether we like it or not. Whether it's good or not, we can argue, we can discuss that, but this is so important that you might actually need some regulatory functions there as well. Some companies involved with critical infrastructure are not very well prepared always. And we see those sort of weak links there very much. Now, the weakest link, if we think about sort of Nordic cooperation on crisis preparedness, during the pandemic, we saw that borders were closed in a very uncoordinated fashion, and that created a lot of problems. So, you know, healthcare people that had been going forward from the Åland Islands, living in Stockholm area, coming to work in Åland Islands and back, they couldn't come anymore, which created a lot of problems for the healthcare system on the Åland Island, for instance. So certainly there are these kinds of problems in a crisis situation when the states revert back to their national interests very much, and that creates then problems for all. So that was certainly a weak link. Another weak link is, of course, you mentioned communication. The sharing of sensitive information is, of course, something that you would need. We have an existing agreement on that, which is quite weak. It could be perhaps stepped up to some extent so that it would to enable the better sharing of risk assessments and risk perceptions in the Nordic region. I think that would be quite important. It actually might become more easy once we're all members of NATO, because then you would have sort of a framework for that.
All right. Then a quick additional question from my side. Once again, I think for the purpose that to ease us into the conversation that is going to follow with business leaders and their experiences. You mentioned the regulatory and the voluntary, segments of this participation in resilience work. I mean, is there also, when you talk to, you conducted an interview with your, business individuals and the representatives of the private sector as well, is there also another factor there, business opportunities that arise from this? Is there a place for this motive as well in order to ensure or to encourage participation by the private sector on this? Or it cannot perhaps be a driving thing behind this, because there are obviously limits to the economic benefit that can be accrued from this interaction. So very broadly, what's your take on that?
Well, I think if I know the Finnish case best, so why are the private companies, why do they decide to involve themselves since it's on a voluntary basis? So they feel that they get vital information from this exchange with the public sector, from this dialogue. I mean, that they get to they get into information that they wouldn't otherwise, right? So that's one incentive for the private sector to involve themselves in that. They also get to...
I'm sorry? What kind of information is that?
Well, the public sector does a lot of foresight, does a lot of risk assessments of its own, right? That
so they know their environment better.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
It might be to do with geopolitics or whatever. But and they also get to, of course, it's also space for a private dialogue to some extent. So these private companies get to talk to each other. Sometimes it's sensitive if you're in a competitor. You don't want to share too much information with your competitor. But actually, in cases even when I know, for instance, Nokia and Ericsson, for instance, they actually share a lot of information when it comes to risk with cyber attacks, because it's in their common interest to do that. So even when we speak in competitors, might have a joint interest in collaborating when it comes to certain risks and threats that they have in common.
Well, Mikael, thank you very much. We're letting you go now until we meet again for our last panel. So thank you very much.